Okay, good evening. Let's call this meeting to order. It's 7:01. Welcome everyone to our June 3rd Lapeer Community School Board of Education meeting. So we will begin this evening with the Pledge of Allegiance. Mr. Hagedorn, would you please lead us through the pledge?
Yep. I pledge allegiance to
the flag
of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Okay, next on our agenda this evening is public comment. Mrs. Moss, did you receive any? I believe you received at least one public comment for this evening.
Yes, from Lapeer Community Schools parent April Lapeer.
Okay, would you please read that for us?
Sure. Like I said, this is from Lapeer Community Schools parent April Lapeer. She would like to say, I would like to take the opportunity to express my most sincere appreciation for the administration and their staff at the buildings of Zemmer, Roland Warner, and Murphy Elementary. Their communication and their continued dedication to the needs of the children and the parents that attend those schools has been a beacon in the middle of this COVID-19 coronavirus storm. As a parent of children that attend those three buildings, I want to commend their efforts to update, educate, and inform the constant changes in the guidance given despite the challenges they face. Weekly emails and monthly virtual PAC meetings from Mr. Downey, monthly virtual PAC meetings, newsletters, and emails from Mr. Stanton and Mr. Stevens outline the important information and express concern at the students' well-being and mental health, and how counselors were available if any student needed some assistance, and reassurance that we would all get through this difficult time together. It has been an enormous comfort to me that my children are fortunate to attend Lapeer Community Schools with these leaders in place. In the words of television's Mr. Rogers, look for the helpers. Jeff Stanton, Wyatt Stevens, Robert Downey, and all their staff are true helpers and true heroes in my eyes, and I wanted to take the time to acknowledge their efforts and share with you all that in this time of uncertainty, we have the best staff in place to weather this COVID storm. Thank you for your time, April Lapeer. That concludes that.
Thank you.
Nice. Great way to kick off a meeting. Yeah.
Yes, great message. Appreciate that. Any other comments that was submitted, or was that it?
Oh, that was the only one.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Moving into our reports this evening. So we have 3 committee reports. All 3 of them have the same exact agenda. So their meeting minutes are all the same. So we're gonna have Mrs. Novak walk us through the Finance and Operations Committee report.
Sure, thank you. So the committee members for Finance and Ops were myself as chairperson, Brad Hagedorn, and Denise Becker. Some others attending the meeting was Matt Wandry, Mark Rader, Kim Stieferle, Danielle Corbell, and Mary Moss. So the meeting was called to order at 3:30 p.m. via Zoom conference. We discussed bus recommendation. Mark Rader reviewed a bus purchase recommendation from Transportation Director Linda Thompson and the committee. She is recommending going with Hoekstra Transportation to purchase 4 used buses. Hoekstra provided a full package which contains 3 77-passenger Type C buses, 2018 or newer, with less than 50,000 miles, and 1 53-passenger Type C bus, 2018 or newer, with less than 50,000 miles, with AC and meets our requirements. It was the consensus of the committee that the board approve the bids for buses, for 4 buses, the number 4, at a cost not to exceed $251,510. The bus bids will be placed on the June 3rd agenda for the board to consider approval. District technology plan, we discussed that next. Superintendent Matt Wandry shared that the district's technology supervisor, Nick Ward, will be retiring July 1st, 2020. In accordance with our current practice, when hiring a supervisor position, a review is done of the current job description and responsibilities. The district is currently evaluating a shared service model for technology delivery. They will complete an assessment and a cost estimate. An update will be shared with the committee as more is learned through negotiations. We discussed the school structure for 2020-21. Matt shared that he had a conference with the state superintendent and other superintendents from the state last Friday in order to gain some information on what instruction will look like for next school year. Unfortunately, there is no new information, which leaves more questions than answers at this time. Some instruction options discussed were face-to-face instruction, 100% virtual, or a hybrid model. He discussed that more than likely a hybrid learning plan might be the best option as of right now and what that might look like for the start of the school year. Meetings will be scheduled this week with the other committees, Transportation Department, and K-12 leadership team in order to discuss thoughts and ideas. And then lastly, we discussed the 2020-2021, so 2020-21 budget. Matt and Mark discussed the reality of having to create a budget and present it to the board at the June 3rd board meeting with upcoming funding still uncertain. Mark reviewed the estimated budget forecast for fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 2021 with 4 different scenarios of potential prorations. There will be a budget presentation at this board meeting tonight at June 3rd. And then we adjourn the meeting at 4:12 p.m.
Thank you, Mrs. Novak. Is there any questions or comments from anyone this evening?
Madam President, with your permission, I'd like to make one comment.
Sure.
Relative to the school structure for 2021, I just want any of our community members, parents, or students who may be watching our live stream to understand and appreciate that these conversations are as of today, June 3rd, 2020, and there's a lot of evolution in the planning of what the administration of school might look like next year. In particular, when we talk about the virtual component, it is quite possible that we could begin the school year in the hybrid model, as Mrs. Novak mentioned, with some limited face-to-face opportunities, but eventually transition into a more what we would call traditional model. We're going to share that plan with parents as soon as possible. I'm still working on logistics with our teachers and our principals. And as I'm sure everyone can imagine, when you're creating 3 separate and distinct plans, the logistics to support each of those is considerably different. So just again, asking for the community to have patience. It is the first week of June. It's made a little bit more difficult here in Lapeer because we are one of a limited districts that offer the year-round balanced calendar option. So anything that we decide as a district has to be implemented a month sooner than the traditional district that's just on a traditional calendar. So we understand that folks are desperate to get information about next year, in particular how to plan for any daycare needs that may be a requirement or place an additional burden on families. So we are considering all the different variables that go into planning for what preparing for a school year looks like for a family. Especially a family that has multiple children at various levels of the district. So we want to say that we recognize and understand the stress that families are under as we're kind of coming out of the lockdown now and beginning to reemerge and try and reengage in the community. And the school district is doing its best and putting its best foot forward to put together a plan that's consistent with what the restrictions that are being placed on us by the state, but also does our best to get our students back engaged, not only in the academic pursuits that they have interest in, but the extracurricular ones as well. So all those things are weighing heavy on our minds. And I mentioned extracurricular, so I know there's lots of questions about athletics, after school clubs, and things that our kids derive a great deal of pleasure from, as do our parents. And so we are working very, very closely with groups like the Michigan High School Athletic Association, the Department of Education, to make sure that we can get those opportunities for kids up and running as soon as possible. So just have some patience, and we will, like we always do, have plenty of communication in the coming weeks once those plans are finalized.
Thank you, Superintendent Wandry. I know this time period is such in fluid. Nothing is concrete, so definitely the patience is needed. Any other comments or questions?
I guess I just have one question, and that is discussions with State Superintendent. Did they indicate that they would be looking at any specific markers that would start to tell us what direction that they are going to direct us to go, as far as a hybrid model or just virtual or whatever? Are they looking at certain indicators?
No, they're not. And that was, I think, to be quite frank, what was probably the most troubling about some of the direction or lack thereof that they're engaging us with, Mr. Keller. I do think, as I've said all along, since the first executive order that administered the lockdown, and with subsequent extensions of that, it's made logistics planning that much more complicated. I do think that we're probably in line to have another meeting, given that there is some finality in sight relative to the lockdown. And for example, the number went from in building congregations to 10 to 100, basically overnight with the governor's announcement. So that was a hopeful sign, Mike, as it relates to a marker, if you will. But there are no specific dates or indicators that they identified for us to say, if this happens, then this will be the result. I think a lot has to do with the phased approach that Governor Whitmer has laid out. So currently the Upper Peninsula and Traverse City have reached phase 5 of the 6-phase plan, hence why they were reopened. I did hear today that there's probably strong indications that by the first week of July, the rest of the state will be considered phase 5. The trickle down of that, however, is really not translated to what school will look like. And for obvious reasons, I think the state has some preoccupation with what they would characterize as some bigger economic issues, where public institutions like counties, cities, school districts, municipal governments are under a different calendar and a time crunch to get this information in order to set their budgets. So still frustrating on our end, Mike, because we're presenting a budget this evening without knowing two pretty significant factors, which is what are the requirements and the standards that they want us to utilize in terms of creating that plan for instruction next year, and what is the number of a potential proration to the foundation. So two pretty significant variables that at this point are still unknown, one of which the student foundation reduction may not be known until late August. So our approval at the final board meeting in June of the budget we're going to discuss this evening, may look very different by the time the state actually produces that number. So I will continue to engage with the folks at MDE, and in particular the Region 5 superintendents that have the opportunity to meet with the state superintendent to hear what their thoughts are. But a long-winded answer to your question, that it's not as though the state is saying, if you have a hybrid plan and if you want to put that in place and announce to the community, here are the standards that it should meet. Basically, right. Individual districts are essentially, and ISDs, literally on their own to develop these plans.
So the district is left having to produce 3 different plans for 3 different scenarios, and to make it yet more difficult, you can't submit anything with hypotheticals in it.
That's correct. One of the things that we've done in Lapeer County, just to give you guys an indication, obviously we know with a deep history of creating some innovative programs, we have made sure to engage our ISD people accounting auditor. Anytime you have an alternative way of dispensing your education platform, you have to take great pains to ensure that how that student is counted, and how do you document their attendance, their participation, if it's in a virtual or homeschool setting. Mm-hmm. And we've been very successful in Lapeer in getting approval for the types of programs that we hope to create. This is no different. We have already reached out to our auditor and said, here's kind of a basic framework of what we are considering. Does this meet the existing standard for people accounting? And so trying to engage them on the front end, so when we do submit these plans, it isn't too far afield from what the auditor would authorize.
Yeah.
But I also think it's a really important point that although we're creating 3 separate and distinct plans, and we may begin the year with one particular plan, the chances of us having to transition to another one of the 2 is very likely. So it won't be in vain that we're developing some, logistics to support the other 2 as well.
No, it's a good point, and it certainly won't be without its challenges. Kudos to you and your team, though.
Yeah, quite a
Thank
bit
you.
of work. Okay, thank you. Any other comments or questions for this evening? Okay. So the Personnel Committee, I will highlight, was held on May 26th at 4:30 via Zoom, and the Teaching, Learning, and Technology Committee was held on May 27th at 5:30. So like I said in the beginning of the report section, we, both of those committees discussed the same exact topics as the report that Mrs. Novak shared. So I will not ask Mr. Nolan or Dr. Watson to give us a report this evening. Okay, so let's move into our presentations this evening. So we have the 2021 budget. Mr. Rader, can you walk us through that news for this evening?
I'll start first on that one, Mark. Just wanted to give the board a heads up that this is a preliminary presentation. Obviously, there's still several weeks prior to what we would be asking the board to adopt in final form at the June 24th meeting. We have had 2 separate budget managers meetings to discuss some of the things that we shared with your board subcommittees. We've asked the budget managers to provide us additional feedback on, out of the box ideas they may have to mitigate some of the shortfalls that we're anticipating. The presentation you're about to see was shared directly with our budget managers to engage them in conversation. So our employees that are part of this process have seen the exact presentation and had the opportunity to provide feedback. And like a board member, will have the opportunity to provide feedback up until we present the final budget proposal at the final meeting in June. So with that, I'll hand it over to Mark.
Mary, if you'd bring up the PowerPoint, please.
You see it?
Yep.
Yes.
Can everyone else?
Yes.
Next slide. So the 4 areas here are the areas of information and education, because as we use the budget manager as much as to share information, we use it also to educate our budget managers, and ultimately when they disseminate that to their respective areas, the rest of the staff in the organization. School aid that the board heard about, and some of this will be repetitive, but for the public, I still want to go through it so the public understands some of the parameters that all 3 committees heard last week. Our budget forecast, as Matt mentioned, what a district deficit position means, and some of the steps and actions that administration would have to perform if we found ourselves in that position based on state cuts. And then, as Matt stated, some talking points and some to-dos for the budget managers to return by tomorrow or by Friday this week, the 5th, for us to continue to disseminate information and develop a final board recommendation for the 24th meeting. Next slide. So this is not new, but it is a nice condensed 1-page summary of the school balance sheet. And as you can all see, where we talk about for the current fiscal year 2019-20, that there's a $1.1 billion shortfall estimated in the School Aid Act. For the fiscal year starting for the state October 1 of 20, their 2021 school year or fiscal year, just shy of $1 billion shortfall in the School Aid Act. And then finally heading towards the positive but still negative 2 years from now for the 21-22 state school budget year, still a $300,000 shortfall. And as I discussed with the board committees, much of the underlying assumptions to these revenues and the expenditures are predicated on some very basic assumptions. One, COVID's going to end, as Matt said, and we seem to be on that downward trend and coming out of the lockdown. But more importantly, the economy starts to start back up and return to where it was pre-COVID, March 13th, 2020.
100%.
And that's a huge assumption. So we'll be watching these. As I shared with the board, in my 30 plus years, there is now going to be, for the first time in my school business career, in August, late August, early September, revenue conference, a third one for the year. And that's because the state's fiscal year ends on September 30th. So they will be waiting to the last moment to see where their revenue estimates that were presented here in May, do they come true to these numbers, or do they degrade, and those bottom minuses get even worse? 1.1 billion become 1.5 or 1.5 billion or whatever, and we are concerned about that. What does that mean from Mr. Keller's question to Matt about not only opening school, but what does it mean for our budget? It means that we will adopt a budget and recommend one here on the 24th of June with probably the assumptions of a lot of qualifications. Qualifications, we don't know if we're going to still get prorated in fiscal 20. We don't know if there will be a proration in fiscal 21. There seems to be indication the state will wait close to their end of their fiscal year to not only adopt a school aid bill for next year, but also make the final decision as to what fiscal 20 proration, if any, could be or would be to districts. So obviously we're concerned about that, and we shared that with the board, and the magnitude, as Lisa shared with the Finance Committee report, that we presented 4 different options, kind of a best case scenario, and then the fourth one, a worst case scenario. What we presented here for the budget managers was a little bit more condensed. Next slide. So instead of having the 4 options, we essentially put it together and said, okay, a $500 cut for fiscal 20 and a $500 proration for fiscal 21. So a total of a $1,000 cut to show the magnitude at the bottom there of $1.3 million in deficit, that the district could be in true deficit for fiscal 21 as soon as the state would adopt a school aid bill for fiscal 21. And do we think that's going to happen? Kind of back anticipating some questions that came from the committees, but also Mr. Keller's question. One, if we forecasted what we've heard as worst case scenario, we've heard that there could be as large as a $700 cut for fiscal 20 and another $700 cut for fiscal 21. So a total of around $1,400 to $1,500 totally cut. So going from $8,100 well below the 7,000 threshold per student funding was what we started with about 4 or 5 weeks ago. What we know is that if that happens, that many districts like Lapeer, but probably in the neighborhood of about half of the school districts in the state, so somewhere in the 300 to 400 school district range, would be in total deficit next year if that was to occur. So what we're seeing and hearing is that we won't get our final answer until late August, early September. What we think will happen is that there will be a combination of tools that's currently in the school, in the legislature's ability, rainy day fund of $1.2 billion with additional legislative action to free up all those dollars. Some movement with not pre-funding and paying down the unfunded liability in the retirement system that the state has been aggressively doing to the tune of about $1 billion a year off the top of the school aid fund. So of the $13 billion to $14 billion school aid fund, $1 billion right off the top just goes to pay the historical debt that is accumulated and underfunded in the state retirement system for school employees. They could lessen that and free up some of those dollars for to cover, so they don't have a deficit in the school aid fund ending September 30th. But if they did that, then there would be the chance that their could or would be less federal assistance. So what we think is going to happen is a combination of some additional federal assistance to states to deal with cities, townships, municipalities, including school districts, like Matt stated earlier, as well as some of the tools in the legislator's toolbox currently in the School Aid Act, and come up with a balancing act. What we may see ultimately is we may see the big cut for those that were around in 2009 recession. We saw the cut of $427 per student, but then we saw from the federal level that we had stimulus dollars that came in that school districts were able to use those as unrestricted dollars to help mitigate some of the decline and damage to their budgets that huge per funding cut caused school districts. So we are hoping for the best, to keep it positive today, that there will be some solution similar to that as we move forward. So this assumption that we shared with the budget manager was to show if we end up in the $1,000 range, we could be in deficit for fiscal year 21 and have to make some serious structural changes going to fiscal 22, because we would have to show the state that we would be eliminating that deficit within a 5-year plan. Next slide. So we shared with the budget managers what fund balance is, because not assuming all of them spend as much time and detail as Danielle and I do, and Colt does on some of these areas. But it's important to understand that the board has been very supportive of the district trying to get back to that 10% kind of goal level of a fund balance. And why do we want to be there? For times like this that we're facing financial uncertainties, so that we can have time to make adjustments to our structural operations and not have to just all of a sudden make huge reductions to staff or programs, and be able to have a little bit of elasticity in our budget, use up fund balance, and then make the cuts in the following year. So we stressed how important it is to have that fund balance, but also knowing that we were just about there at June 30th of 19, at 9.35% fund balance. But you can see the magnitude of this cut that they're talking about could wipe out that fund balance 100% gone in one fiscal year. So we're concerned about that, but it's also there for that purpose, is to help us get through some very difficult times like we're facing right now. Next slide. And then we spent a little bit of time defining and explaining what a deficit means. Is it the worst case scenario? Some would say yes. Does the district want to be in deficit? No, because it means that we've consumed and used up all of our reserves, plus our anticipated revenues will not meet our anticipated expenditures for a given year. So that's never a good financial position to be in. But if you have certain tools in place and the ability to make adjustments within a reasonable timeliness, you can work your way out of that deficit, usually in short order. But really what's tied to deficit that really raises our concern is the additional work the board and the district administration will have to do to the state. And ultimately, the middle there, the state school code requires that it's not Treasury who comes in, or Michigan Department of Education, MDE, who will decide how to balance this budget. It's the board and administration's responsibility to still make decisions to adjust the expenditures to meet the projected revenues in order to have a positive fund balance or not a deficit for the district. Are the reports unwieldy? No, but it is another layer of responsibility. And I pointed out at the bottom, failure to submit the deficit elimination plan within 30 days of the district. The ultimate tool that the state has is they will start withholding state aid from districts who don't submit that. Have they done that? Yes, they have. Pontiac's most recent memory of that, who was struggling to get their deficit elimination plan in order. And so they did withhold the state aid for a month. And as we all know, that just creates havoc on the cash flow side that I'll talk about in a minute. If they don't accept what we initially submit, there is the process for the district to revise that, submit it again. Again, if you are negligent and or slow in doing that, they will again use the state aid to withhold to get you to act in a timely manner. And then there's the monthly budgetary reports, because what they don't want is they don't want a district to submit a deficit elimination plan and stating you will come out or you have X amount of expenditures, and when you get to the end of the year, your actual expenditures exceeded what you stated and you go further into deficit. So that is the reason why they want to see monthly budgetary reports, which currently no district is required to do to the state by any measure for state aid, but that is a measure once you're on deficit. Next slide. And then now cash flow. So cash flow has been a concern, as all three committees heard last week, because if you go back to the forecast model, if the district was to submit a budget showing we were going to adopt a deficit budget starting July 1, within 30 days, by the end of July, the district would have to submit a deficit elimination plan. The problem is, as Matt stated earlier, we do not have any solid information to think we're going to get $0 or $1,000 cut. We just keep hearing hints. So obviously, we're waiting to see if we can get better information right up to the doorstep of when we have to submit the budget for the 24th to the board. More than likely, the board will see a budget submitted, as we explained, that will keep the district in a positive fund balance initially, with the caveat that as soon as the school aid bill is passed sometime in late August, early September, the district could immediately be thrust into a deficit position. And then that would start the deficit elimination plan development, submission, and other required items. The concern that we have is if it goes to worst case scenario, the district would need somewhere in the magnitude of $10 to $12 million of cash flow borrowing. If we submit a budget that is somewhat balanced, that will only generate around $7 million in cash flow borrowing for us. So obviously you can't submit a fictitious budget to make it look like worst case scenario, because that kicks in the deficit elements of the school aid bill, but you don't want to be cut short. So Danielle and I had a number of key conversations here last Friday and again yesterday. Last Friday was with our legal counsel regarding cash flow, and just for us to understand what we thought we knew, which is you don't want to submit a deficit budget to start with to be able to get as much money as you may need. But we also found out that more than likely Treasury will do not only their normal August borrowing that we participate in, but they will probably do a December and a spring 21 borrowing. So when you start to read the tarot cards, will there be a cut? Probably, if I'm reading between the lines, because if Treasury is looking to do a December borrowing and a spring borrowing, they know there's going to be some actions that are going to cause districts to need to borrow more than they initially submit in their June budgets and for the August borrowing. That's one option. The second option is we can go to the local bank, and through a submission process with Treasury, we could get short-term borrowing from our local bank. Danielle and I had that conversation this week, and Choice One, formerly Lake Stone, is well positioned to support the district if we find ourselves in that position. So we feel pretty confident that no matter where the budget goes with the state, we know we can cover our cash flow borrowing to make sure that the cash flow needs are met for fiscal 21 for the district. So that's a much better position today than we were a week ago when I first was sharing information with the board in the committee format. Relief. Do we think there's going to be some federal relief? Yes. So I put on here so that the budget managers understood If you've followed the news and you've heard, yes, there was, I believe it was in CARES Act 2, $390 million that state of Michigan received. And put the caveat there, that's really just additional Title I dollars. That money, when you hear them speak on the news, the state legislators and the governor, and talk about they need to free up the rules for the CARES Act relief dollars, this is one in particular they're referring to. Though Lapeer's estimate in the publicized document so far is roughly 560,000, we cannot really use that for any potential backfill for proration cut, nor any other, not even for additional COVID expenditures. They truly follow the Title I usage rules as it stands today. But the state has been working with the feds to release and ease that up, so we could use it for districts who have incurred additional COVID-19 costs here since March 16th, and possibly to use in the toolbox for, and if the prorations were to come for school districts. And then the last is just to give them the framework. The return to old normal, not likely in the short run, was just to kind of cover what Matt covered, that we're trying to still figure out, is it a blended, is it totally remote, is it face-to-face, but with the new parameters and paradigm of distance, different hygiene and cleaning methodologies, face mask, etc. So do we know we're going to be somewhere there? Yes, we just don't know where we're going to be in that paradigm right now. So just to kind of let people know, be prepared. Things are going to change and continue to change, but we probably won't return to our old normal anytime soon, or at least for fiscal 21. Next slide. And then we finished up with next steps, as Matt mentioned, that we gave a couple assignments, as we always ask our budget managers to participate and contribute in the budget process, to think of, in light of potential changes that we talked about for the 2021 school year, what are possible cost saving or cost reductions in their respective areas, and then also any operational savings that may occur as a result of changes in the school year, aka if we're modifying busing or cleaning or what have you. We may have additional costs in the way of some additional personal protective equipment costs, but we may be able to save in some other areas and not overall increase every line budget item out there. And so we developed a form. I believe that all that information was in the Weekender this past weekend, and those budget managers have the assignment to go back this week and gather input and submit that by this Friday. That was what was presented. Questions?
Any questions or comments?
Someone's got to have a question. Michael.
Mark, I just want to make sure that I understand this properly, that, you know, the deficit reduction plan aspect of this, do you have any time as a district to react and go into budget amendment before you get put in this deficit reduction plan process? I mean, we can amend our budget right away if we need to.
Yes, and we always have that ability, and yes, we could. So yes, we can do that. The question becomes the reality of what, in practical terms, could we reduce at that point in time once the school year starts, or where we're at. So what we talked about, for instance, like this year, we're finishing up here in a week the school year. So essentially we will be done with our 12 months of operation. We still get 2 more payments of our funding in July and August. That's what's at risk for the state to take and prorate us. So we've incurred 100% of our expenses here by June, but we may not get 100% of our budgeted revenue. So could we make adjustments? No. Go into fiscal 21. Could we make some adjustments to our expenditures? We probably could, and we've thought about that, but it will determine the magnitude of how fast and how deep we could make to adjust to that. That's why the fund balance is so important, because we use that as kind of the the relief valve for what you can't do immediately to buy you that time to when you can develop fiscal year 22's budget and make those structural changes. Lisa.
So I lived through the 2009 proration, and we used the example of, maybe this will help answer Mike's question, is you've got kindergarten classes set, maybe 4 of them across the district, 5 of them, whatever. You can't all of a sudden say to parents, guess what, you're losing your teacher, and now we're putting all your kids into a different classroom. I mean, it just creates chaos for kids and the parents. So you can make changes, you're right. It's just, can you actually make those changes and not make everyone upset and hurt during all of this? So yeah, it's a big deal.
Correct. Well, and to Lisa's point, I mean, let's not forget that the primary reason to have a fund equity is to be able to absorb these types of reductions, not necessarily in totality of the dollar amount, but the timing. And so Lisa makes a great point. I mean, we're going to set class sizes. We're going, the entire staffing process will be complete. So if you experience a proration at that point in the summer, ostensibly everything is at your disposal in terms of mitigating that reduction. But what is realistic in terms of delivering a quality product to your customers? And I think Lisa that's a perfect example. So, let's say it's August 16th, and do we want to reduce the number of staff and then as a result, send out notices to parents and families that, hey, everything's changing for the fall. And oh, by the way, school starts in 3 days, 4 days or a week, and do that. So, and I think it's important for the community members who are watching to appreciate the fact that this district has been in a declining enrollment status for going on almost 20 years. And the fact that we've been able to essentially in less than 9 years, more than double our fund balance, even being in a declining revenue position, is exactly why we stand to absorb this cut. And again, just to reiterate a few points Mark made, actually just one point, these numbers are good guesses, but they're pure guesses. But beyond that, they also represent zero assistance from either the state or the feds, which we don't think, just as a matter of practicality, is going to happen. We think there's going to be some federal or state offset or both. There's already discussion, although preliminarily about more, I think, liberal requirements as it relates to grant dollars and how those are spent. But certainly, this is worst case scenario, and we stand in a pretty decent position to absorb that through the fund balance. Now, it's not. It took us 9 years to double the fund balance. So we're not presenting this plan as a way to say this is our preference, but at the same time, it needs to be reflective of the fact that we've done a lot of hard work in the last almost 10 years to put us in a position to be able to absorb this kind of a reduction.
I also think, just another point, I think people get concerned that fund equity or fund balance is cash, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's cash. It could be tied up in assets, and you can't sell those assets. So it's not yes, we're thankful, very thankful we have a fund equity, absolutely. But we have to keep in perspective that doesn't mean that our cash flow is perfect.
Good point.
Well, I'm looking at this, from a little bit different angle. I mean, the impact of COVID has been, this is historical. The federal government has already, you saw some of the response they've had sending out checks, and I think it's really no different. There's education groups right now that are working, trying to convince them to free up $175 billion US wide. That would give Michigan $3.4 billion. And the other end of that on the state level is, if we're talking about, fixing roads or fixing schools, we all want the roads fixed, but a pothole can wait. It's very, very hard to fix somebody's education if you're not able to give them what they need now. And those are the messages I think that we need to deliver, both nationally and at the state level here. And the other thing that I'm thinking about is I see some of these, penalties for deficit reduction acts and things like that. Look, this is unprecedented times, and I just can't even imagine that when these laws were written, that they even thought about having this kind of impact across the state on these districts. And I believe that another message we should be carrying is that they should be looking at waiving some of those provisions in these acts. I even think about like teacher evaluations. How in the world do you do a teacher evaluation after a school year like this? So there's a lot of things in a lot of acts that they really probably should be visiting, saying, does this make sense right now? And that it doesn't have to be a permanent change, but it certainly should be maybe for this school year until we have more information. We can kind of get our act together as a state and where we're headed. So just thoughts on my mind, that's all.
Good points.
I'll get off my soapbox.
Good points, though, Mike. Good points. Any other questions or comments tonight?
I know we run through all the numbers. What is that big chunk number that is going to hit us, that you're thinking is going to hit us square in the face?
I've spent a lot of time, I've talked to a lot of people. I'm leaning more where Mike just made his comment, and Matt and I have commented numerous times in the last week. Do I think we're going to have to share in a reduction? Yes. What I hope doesn't happen is what Mr. Keller just stated is if, and I think it's not an if, I think we will get some federal relief, but when that federal relief comes, hopefully politics don't play into it and it gets distributed across and doesn't go where it's really needed, aka education. So don't steal it to deal with others. That said, those negative numbers I showed in the opening sheet there are twice as bad for the state's general fund. So they're $2 billion in the hole for this year. They're $1.8 billion in the hole for next year, and still I think $1 billion for the third year. So the state's general fund is way worse off than the school aid fund, which is why I make the comment, if we are fortunate to get, let's say the numbers using Mike's numbers, 3-point-some billion, let's hope they share that the School Aid Act is made whole and keep that away from any cuts that have to occur to schools and deal with the general fund separately. But we've seen in the last 20 years that's not the case, where the relief fell for the general fund, AKY, there's still $750 million every year coming out of the School Aid Act to pay for higher education. That used to be 100% paid out of the general fund. So being a realist, do I think it'll be some combination? I think so, Craig. I don't think we'll see 1,400. I'm not even sure we'll see 1,000 because the magnitude of those cuts will devastate so many districts. The state doesn't have the ability to manage it. Even if they waive some of those requirements, you're talking districts who won't recover. And for those of us who either remember or were around when Escanaba turned the keys in 1992 to the State Board of Education, that's exactly what happened. That school board could not get the local property tax owners to pass a millage in order to generate enough money to operate the school district. They tried numerous times, and eventually the local board handed the keys to the school district and all the assets to the State Board of Education and said, in the Constitution, that public education is your problem, here you go. And the end result was Prop A. So a little bit of history lesson there. That's why Prop A came around, one of the reasons, because we couldn't afford to have that in our structure. So I don't think the worst case scenario is going to happen because you're talking that to magnitude of 1,000 times. And I just hope that it's something we can manage, like Matt said, in the 600 to 700 cumulative, that we can absorb in a fund balance in the short term, and then structurally make the changes and start to dig ourselves back out of the hole with building our fund balance again for the next time we have a financial challenge to the district and the state.
But also an important point is we have never really relied on our fund balance, at least in my time here, as the primary go-to to offset a potential reduction. I think to Mark's point, it's really, really important to note that the reason why this time that is the option that we are going to recommend is because to make structural changes in June to fundamentally alter staff numbers or any sort of delivery would be foolish, because there's really no way to determine what that number is going to be. This truly does represent what I would characterize as the most legitimate utilization of fund balance dollars when there's so many unknowns. You know, we have done this for so long to the degree that the numbers that we use to input as projections in doing our forecasting are very, very accurate. We've demonstrated that year after year after year. So the reason why our fund balance has been able to grow even in a declining revenue position is because our forecasting has been so accurate and been based on real numbers. And because they've been accurate, we've been able to make structural changes, right, and reductions, knowing that the numbers were authentic. So when you're literally doing this kind of voodoo economics, if you will, where the number, it could be anywhere from 0 to 1,400, it doesn't make a lot of sense to make major structural change when, to Mark's point, and Mike mentioned it as well, there is a small percentage of us that thinks there will be significant dollars to offset this loss, and maybe we only realize a $200 or $300 reduction per student. Now, to place a percentage of likelihood on either one of those scenarios is an exercise in futility, which we don't have the luxury to do. But at the same time, we've been doing this long enough to say, I'm not going to fundamentally change the district structurally when we don't have these many knowns. And so the reason I asked Mark to spend some time explaining what fund balance is, explaining what being in a deficit position from a fund balance perspective actually looks like, is the education component of this presentation, to make sure that folks go in with eyes wide open, full disclosure, to know what we're committing to. But in the face of not knowing definitively, Craig, to your point, what is the number that does it? We've done the math. We know the average fund balance across the state of every district, similar sized districts, and all 500 plus K-12s across Michigan. If we realize $1,000 per student reduction, you would literally have 200 to 300 districts in a deficit position, and that's just a fact. To Mike Keller's point, this is a historic time.
Okay.
As Mrs. Bush would say, it's a rainy day fund and it's pouring.
Yes, it is a rainy day, that's for sure, and pouring. Any other comments or questions? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rader. This is definitely some difficult times, really unprecedented times. So appreciate all the work from the COLT, the budget managers, to help us develop what would be the right budget at the time to move us forward. So appreciate that. Okay, moving into our action items portion of the agenda. The first, we have a consent grouping. That is the approval of the minutes of May 6, 2020 regular meeting, 2 set organizational meeting for 9 a.m. on July 16, 2020, and set public hearing for budget for 7 p.m. on June 24, 2020. In this consenting group, are there any items anyone wishes to be removed? Okay, I'm hearing none.
I'll make a motion that the reading of the minutes and policies be waived and that the consent agenda items be approved as presented.
I'll second.
Okay, I have a nomination by Mrs. Novak and a support by Dr. Watson. Mr. Hagedorn,
Aye.
Mrs. Novak,
Aye.
Mrs. Becker,
Aye.
Mr. Nolan,
Aye.
Mr. Keller,
Aye.
Dr. Watson,
Aye.
and Mrs. Putnam says aye. Motion carries 7-0. Okay, next item is probationary teacher resolution. So each year the board considers a resolution that acknowledges probationary and tenure status pursuant to the Teachers Tenure Act.
I move that the probationary teacher performance resolution be approved as presented.
I'll support.
Okay, I have a nomination by Mr. Keller, support by Mr. Hagedorn. Any discussions? Hearing none. Mr. Hagedorn,
Aye.
Mrs. Novak,
Aye.
Mrs. Becker,
Aye.
Mr. Nolan,
Aye.
Mr. Keller,
Aye.
Dr. Watson,
Aye.
and Mrs. Putnam says aye. Motion carries 7-0. Okay, so that brings us to the last action item is the bus bids. So the Finance and Operations Committee is supporting Linda Thompson's recommendation to purchase 4 used buses from Hookstraw Transportation. Hookstraw provided a full package which contains 3 77 passenger type C buses, 2018 or newer with less than 50,000 miles, 1 53 passenger type C bus, 2018 or newer with less than 50,000 miles with AC. All 4 buses must meet the requirements in the bid for a total of $251,510. Do I have any nominations?
Make a motion to accept the bid.
I'll second that.
Okay, so Dr. Watson, and motion by Dr. Watson and supported by Mrs. Becker. Any discussion?
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Nolan?
Mark, will you just educate anyone who happens to be listening to this as to why it is that we're spending $251,000 on buses given the discussion of the budget forecast that we just talked about? We know why we're doing this, but could you put
Yes.
that out there for us, please?
So we have a fleet of some 65 buses. Basically, it's comprised of 55 who make daily regular routes, and there's 10 spares, and those 10 spares are for normal routine maintenance and repairs, aka oil changes or other mechanical issues that happen on a bus. Every year, the Michigan State Police are required to do an inspection of the buses. This year's inspection was just completed, started pre-COVID, was completed about 2 weeks ago, was suspended for a period of time during the COVID time period. And during that time period, there were 5 buses where the inspector passed them this year with some modifications, but clearly indicated to us he does not want to see those buses in the inspection loop for next year. Essentially, they need to be retired and replaced. We don't have the luxury of getting rid of 5 buses, because if we go with only 5 for spares, we run the chance that some days we may not have enough spares in order to deal with breakdowns, repairs, etc. So our normal replacement schedule should be 8 buses a year to maintain somewhere between an 8.5 to 10 year tenure or amortization of a bus. Our current fleet has an average lifespan of about 13.5 years. So we have 2 purposes of why we're recommending this. One, we know we have buses that are aging and that are susceptible to the Michigan State Police red tagging and permanently taking them out of operation during the school year. And 2, we need to get that average life cycle of those buses down. And we've been only purchasing 4 of the recommended 8 that we should be for. This will be now the 7th year in a row. So we're staying as conservative as we can in our budget, but still trying to be fiscally responsible with maintaining a healthy fleet so that we don't have exorbitant cost in the transportation budget for repairs, transmission, engine replacements, etc.
Thank you, Mark.
You're welcome.
Appreciate that. Any other discussion? Okay, hearing none. Mr. Hagedorn,
Aye.
Mrs. Novak,
Aye.
Mrs. Becker,
Aye.
Mr. Nolan,
Aye.
Mr. Keller,
Aye.
Dr. Watson,
Aye.
and Mrs. Putnam says aye. Motion carries 7-0. Okay, that ends our action items for this evening. Let's move on to our board member communication topics. Anybody have any topics they'd want to share this evening?
I will.
Okay.
I was downtown today when they were putting up the signs for the kids, and it was a beautiful sight. It's coming down right away to look at them, so that's a really great thing between the communication, or I should say collaboration, of all the people and all the groups that put that together. And I am excited to see that we're able to do seniors than we thought we were originally going to be able to do.
So I'll follow up with that as a senior parent, that this week has been, or this whole thing has been very challenging, but very excited about what the district's doing for our seniors. I helped assist with Project Graduation, and we packed 400 bags last night for all of our graduates. So we've done everything we can with the money we had. Our donations were down due to COVID, but we did very well with, I think, what we had raised at that point. I'm excited about the signs. I already went down and I saw them. I saw my daughters. A little concerned about the vandalism at the high school with signs. So I'm a little concerned at the time period that they're down there, like when they're going to be released to the parents. I just don't want to see anything. There was a lot of money invested in those, and I don't want to see anything happen to those. So I know the parents are excited about those. Last but not least, I just want to say a huge thank you. I've had so many conversations with Mr. Lindsay at the high school, and the secretaries and the staff, the teachers. They're just going above and beyond. I don't know how Mr. Lindsay does it, especially during this time. I just support him and appreciate him and all their work for what they're doing. I know the parents appreciate it. We're excited that we actually get to watch our kids get their diplomas, so we're excited about the plan, and extremely happy about that. And I think that's it.
Thank you.
I just got 2 quick ones. The football golf outing is July 18th out at the Lapeer Golf and Country Club. Very excited for that. And then the other one is just a big thank you to our retirees. We're not giving them the send-off that they deserve or that we normally give, but just a big thank you to all of them, and look forward to going out to lunch tomorrow to thank Debbie Daly and Nancy Lapeer for all their work. So.
Thank you. Any other comments?
I'm just going to throw out there the golf idea. Our par 3 for the leader fund got pushed. We're looking at August 29th. Hoping that works out if things don't change, but at least it's on the schedule again. It was just postponed to be determined. So we actually have a date, and need to get filling up those coffers because teachers are going to need it. Classrooms are going to need it, and wherever we can get it, we'll take it. So looking forward to that.
Great, thank you. Mr. Nolan?
Thank you. I want to echo what everybody said. This is a time where I think we should be and are very thankful for those that we have working for us all throughout the district. I mean, Matt and the administrative team who's working tirelessly to try to deal with all of the unknowns. I mean, we can't thank you guys enough for everything that you're going through to try to create, like we heard tonight, scenarios of if comes when we don't really know what's going to happen. And, you know, the thought of spending all of that time and all of that energy into creating scenarios you hopefully won't even have to use or put into place is just, you know, we can't thank you guys enough. I think a lot of people don't realize all of the work that goes on behind the scenes and all the work that you do to make our district a better place. Our staff, I mean, again, normally we're in a much better setting, much better able to communicate with everyone, that we really do appreciate everything that they're doing for us, everything that they've done. You know, we don't have access to people right now to personally thank them, or frankly, up until recently here, to even shake someone's hand and say thank you. We should all be thankful. We should all be proud of the work that's being done. We've chuckled over the years that we're sort of the district, you know, the MacGyver district. You give us a stick of chewing gum and a paper clip and we can make it work. And I have no doubt that our staff and our administrative team will make this work. And so I just want to say thank you to everyone who's put in all the time, and all the time that I know is going to be put in the future. You guys will make it work. And to Mr. Lindsay and his team, I agree. I mean, what a great plan. I've heard from so many folks who have seniors in other districts who don't really have an opportunity to do anything. There is a huge sense of loss for these people. I mean, at best, they're getting a drive-by. You guys, we're actually able to hand out diplomas, and we're going to have people from families there to see it and at least restore some sense of normalcy to the graduating seniors and their families. And I really appreciate all the efforts that have gone into making that happen. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Keller, any comments or topics this evening?
Well, I will echo the same sentiments. I think that what we're doing for the graduates is a wonderful thing. I was so concerned about just walking in their shoes for a minute, what it would be like to be a graduate in 2020. And it's sad, but it's just a reality that we all have to deal with. And I'm just glad that some people came up with some really good ideas to help them through this time. The only other comments I want to reemphasize, I think this is a very challenging time. It's challenging for the district, and they are working very hard to try to get through these things. And I think that sharing our ideas with Representative Howell, Senator Daley, Congressman Mitchell, getting those ideas out, it can't hurt to at least reach out and say, hey, look, this is what we're going through. Because we're not always going to be in their focus. They're dealing with a lot of things as well. And so it helps for them to just get a few words from us, say, you know, this is what we're dealing with and the frustration we're having and the problems we're having. We want to make next school year as smooth as possible. And, you know, anything we can do to stay away from deficit elimination plans and all of that, that would be a good thing. So I just ask everybody to share those thoughts. So,
thank you. And I myself echo all the comments made tonight. I appreciate all the effort made for these graduates. I want to congratulate all of the 2020 graduates. I know this was not the ending that they were looking forward to, but I am really glad and pleased all the ideas and everything that we get to execute this week for them. And still continue to give them what they deserve during this rough time. So I really appreciate that. And all the hard work from the district. You guys are definitely amazing, and you always come through with some wonderful ideas and able to execute it. So appreciate everything. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Superintendent Wandry, for your comments this evening.
Thank you, Madam President. Again, thank our employees. It's been a trying time, and not to belabor the point, but it's been great to work with our various groups to step up in the planning and execution of all the plans that have happened so far and are going to continue. We have to pay special tribute to someone on this call this evening, and she is going to be really mad at me, but that's okay. Mary Moss was recently honored by the district as one of our Distinguished Service recipients for 2020. And although it was a non-traditional year where we don't get the opportunity to celebrate our retirees and our award recipients at the annual recognition banquet, Mrs. Sieferle and I did have a really good time driving around to all the recipients' homes to deliver a sign, take pictures, and have a conversation with not only our employees, but some of their family members, their spouses, their children, their dogs. And we had a great time. But we want to pay special tribute to Mary, who obviously has worked in the district for a number of years, and anyone that works very closely with her knows that she's certainly distinguished. So I'll tell the funny story to the millions of viewers watching and to the esteemed board members and cult representatives here on this board. We issued the award initially to many of our recipients in what were maybe fake Zoom meetings to get as many people on board as possible. But unfortunately, Mary was part of the entire K-12 meeting, and where we presented the award to her, and her first response was, "I can't believe you gave this to me. I didn't even do my hair." So it looks as though she's done her hair. She looks great. And but we all got quite a chuckle out of that. So when you see Mary, make sure to congratulate her for that. Also want to celebrate our graduates. I was just kind of panning the screen here and looking at the number of folks, both from the Colt team and the board members, who have actually had a child as a graduate. And so we certainly can personalize what it means to sit as a parent, not as a board member or a school administrator, in the audience watching your son or daughter walk across that stage, receive their diploma, and celebrate that achievement as an entire family. So it's an emotional time when you don't get the opportunity to participate in all those things. I mean, gosh, swing out's been a part of our district for decades. Commencement is one thing, but we have some pretty unique and cool things that we do here in Lapeer. And I do also want to echo, Mr. Lindsay is one stressed out high school principal right now. I mean, these end of year events are hard enough to manage in normal, quote unquote, normal times, let alone having to do all this. And Doug's another guy. His oldest and my oldest are the same age, both graduated from high school last year. So he has that depth of understanding as a parent and as someone responsible for coordinating these events. So the praise directed at Doug and his team is well deserved. So congratulations again to our seniors, and I certainly echo those statements. I wanted to take just a brief moment on a personal note. It's been a pretty difficult week, I think, or couple weeks, watching what's happening across the nation in response to some pretty horrific things. And I know that a number of organizations and a number of individuals who are public figures have taken some time to speak to what the events that happened in Minneapolis, what impact they have and may continue to have going forward. And I think, I grew up in the city of Detroit. My dad was a Detroit City police officer. And so many of the things that are taking place in our nation right now are particularly personal to me, not just as a superintendent, but as a human being, as a man. And I really, every time something like this happens, a major national event, I always, I think my comments or my feelings, always go through a few different filters. And the one filter that my comments, that I just want to preface what I'm about to say, it's going through the filter of being an educator. And what would I want, because I have 3 children, who are young adults and getting ready to go into the world. And as we sit down at the dinner table and try to make sense of some of the things that we're watching on TV, that's as a dad, but also as an educator, and trying to pull lessons from it, and what kind of lessons and knowledge can I impart to my own children as we're trying to just process everything that's happening. And I would just say that Our discourse as a nation, whether we're talking about cultural or social or political issues, has really grown increasingly vitriolic in the last decade or so, where people on any side of an argument really struggle to empathize with people that aren't like them, that maybe have a different perspective. We failure to see the value in compromise. We're not very good listeners. We seem to retreat to our camp and throw out attacks at those who disagree with us. And I would, as an educator, like to posit the radical notion that what we need to be talking to our young people about is empathy, understanding, good listening, compromise. And it's okay to be educators, it's our primary charge is to help students, young people, know what are emotional feelings into productive dialogue, into solutions, into making their world a better place, whatever these. Not necessarily speaking for the organization, but speaking as an individual, as a citizen of our country, I would really like to see I just want to encourage our community, our leaders, and that's those parents, those are business owners, those are teachers, just help kids process this information and do so in a responsible manner. And that's all I think all we can ask of our education system and those that make it up, which are our teachers, our students, our parent community. So that concludes my sentiments for the evening, Madam President. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Superintendent Wandry. I appreciate those words that you shared. Very meaningful. Okay, that brings us to our adjournment tonight. Do I have a motion on the table?
Motion to adjourn.
So I think that was Mrs. Becker, and do I have a support?
Support.
Okay, Mr. Hagedorn, support. Okay, Mr. Hagedorn?
Aye.
Mrs. Novak?
Aye.
Mrs. Becker?
Aye.
Mr. Nolan?
Aye.
Mr. Keller?
Aye.
Dr. Watson?
Aye.
Mrs. Putnam says aye. Motion carries 7-0. Thank you, guys. Everybody have a wonderful evening.
All righty.
Have a great night, folks.
Sunday.
Thank you.
See you Sunday.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Sunday or tomorrow night.
Yes.